I'd like to call the meeting to order. Can we have a roll call, please, clerk?
Alderman Ashour?
Here.
Alderman Berry?
Here.
Alderman Bevere?
Here.
Alderman Davalos?
Here.
Alderman Goodman?
Here.
Alderman Krischel?
Here.
Alderman Widener?
Here.
Alderman Wilson?
Here.
Thank you. Will those who are able stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance? Thank you. This is the time we have set aside for citizens' comments. I don't have anyone signed up to speak, but if anyone would like to speak on the items of the agenda as they come up, please let us know. I also want to note that we're moving item 10 up to number 2 tonight. But we will get started now with officials and staff comments, starting with the mayor.
Thank you. Just one thing, a big thank you to Warrenville in Bloom for their workday Saturday morning. Got a lot of flowers planted in about 3 hours around town. So everybody notice the rain is going to help them all take root, I'm sure. The efforts are greatly appreciated, and I get a lot of positive comments from folks. So thank you, Warrenville and Bloom, again for your work on Saturday morning and for your continued efforts to make Warrenville a beautiful place.
Thank you. Any other officials and staff who have comments? I wanted to congratulate Police Chief Toronto for his election as the Executive Board Chairman of Merit, the new DuPage Metropolitan Emergency Response and Investigative Team for the whole county. So congratulations, Chief. We're very proud of you representing us and for the hard work that you do on that. I also wanted to remind everybody that the Torch Run is on Sunday. That's June 2nd. I believe it's starting out by the Burger King, the Warrenville Commons, at 8:30 a.m., and that's going to be in support of the Illinois Special Olympics. So if you see the runners, then cheer them on, and if you're interested in running, you can contact the police department about that, I believe. All right. Let's start with the business of the meeting. We will begin with an informational update on the former Citgo gas station property at 28 West, 244 Warrenville Road, and Community and Economic Development Director Menser will tell us about that item.
Good evening, and thank you. Just not quite 2 weeks ago, the current owners of the former Citgo gas station located at the northeast corner of Warrenville Road and Batavia Road listed their property for auction. The auction is set to be completed at the end of next month. It's a sealed bid auction, and there's an undisclosed reserve that's attached to the property. Given the city's relatively recent interest in the possible acquisition of this property, we are, from a staff perspective, recommending that the City Council conduct a closed session discussion of the city's interest in this property at next Monday's City Council meeting. However, in order to allow that discussion to be as productive as possible, we wanted to take this opportunity and provide a status update to the full City Council, or the Committee of the Whole, on the existing conditions of the property, revisit and refresh everybody's memory on the city's recent involvement in the potential acquisition of the property, talk about quickly what would be involved for somebody to reuse the property in an as-is condition, as well as what hurdles and what things would need to be done or accomplished in order to redevelop the property. And then finally, address any questions that the council may have and identify any specific information requests that the City Council would like staff to assemble and bring forward at next Monday's discussion. From an existing condition standpoint, there are still 4 existing gasoline tanks in the ground on the site. The Office of the State Fire Marshal has issued violation notices for all 4 of those tanks, 3 of which they've condemned in order to be removed from the property because of their age and the fact that they're only single-wall tanks. They're over 30 years old. Unfortunately, the current property owner has not abided by the Office of State Fire Marshal's requests, and the violation notices that have been issued on the property have been turned over to the Attorney General's office for prosecution, which is, to be perfectly honest with you, on a case like this, is somewhat of a black hole. The Attorney General's office, this isn't the top of their list of priorities to deal with. From an IPA, Illinois Environmental Protection Agency standpoint, there's an existing leaking underground storage tank incident that's open on the property. That incident stems back to 1997 when the property was owned and operated by Phillips Petroleum. They removed the leaking underground storage tanks from the property and replaced them with a new tank at that point in time. However, they have not finalized the closeout of that incident. It is their intent, and they've been working over the last 20 plus years to close it out by leaving the contamination that's remaining on the property in place and leaving it covered with either asphalt or concrete, and then recording a land use restriction on the property that would prevent it from being used for any type of residential and or public open space use. The property has significant floodplain impacts. About 2/3, the eastern 2/3 of the property is located within the 100-year floodplain for the DuPage River. That includes the portion of the site that the existing convenience store is located on, so the convenience store is located within the floodplain also. From a property tax standpoint, the owners have not paid their 2017 taxes, which collectively they're about just short of $20,000. As we all know, if you have a house in DuPage County or property in DuPage County, our 2018 taxes are due the first installment next Monday. While there has been a significant reduction in the assessment on the property based on the fact that it's vacant and its current condition, it's unlikely in my mind that the owners will decide to pay the 2018 taxes, at least the first installment of those taxes. Beginning last fall, the city was trying to work with the property owner to address a variety of city code violations on the property, both property maintenance and vacant building registration ordinance violations. It took a while for them to address some of those violations, but not all of those violations. So there's some existing outstanding violations still remaining on the property. We have not been invited into the property itself, into either one of the buildings, to do an internal inspection of the buildings as required by the vacant building registration program. And ultimately, earlier this year, the outstanding violations and the lack of progress that the property owner was making on remediating those violations was referred through the city's administrative adjudication process, and there was a significant amount of fines that had accrued and were applied to the property when the property owner was found guilty. Those fines have never been paid, and there is now a lien on the property that the city has recorded to ensure that those fines are ultimately paid at some point in time. The property has been and remains Zone B4, Motor Service District. That's the city's most intense commercial retail type zoning classification. But even within that zoning classification, gas stations are what we term as a special use, so they're not allowed by right. They would require a special approval by the city council, which is a discretionary approval subject to established approval criteria in our ordinances. And now that the gas station has ceased operation for more than a year, the special use permit that had applied to the property automatically expired, and anybody that would wish to open a new gas station on the property would need to go back through the public hearing process, and the city would need to decide that that would be an appropriate use going forward on the property. So let's just revisit quickly the city's recent involvement. You may recall, for those that were on the council, From 2016 to 2018, the city spent a considerable amount of effort and energy negotiating with the current property owners on the potential acquisition of the property. We executed a couple of different letters of intent with the property owners that outlined the detailed business terms under which the city would have purchased the property. Ultimately, those negotiations weren't successful and didn't result in the city's acquisition of the property, primarily because the property owner decided that the business terms that they and the city had agreed to were not something that they could ultimately financially implement. So the business terms really were centered on the city's goal to have the existing property owner demolish all the improvements on the property, all the building improvements, I should say, structural improvements, and clean up the property to residential cleanup standards rather than commercial cleanup standards. Cleaning it up to residential standards would have required the removal of a lot of the, most if not all, the contamination from the property. Couldn't just be left there and covered up. Residential standards, just for a point of reference, is the same cleanup standards that the city cleaned up the Musselman property in order to facilitate the redevelopment of that property in its current form. So what was really driving the city's negotiations back in 2016 and 2018? From my recollection, I think there was, at least from the majority of the council that supported moving forward with that initiative, felt that, and staff felt the same way, is that it was unlikely that the private sector was going to find a way to make it, to remediate and deal with all the outstanding issues on the property in a manner that would allow it to be reused and redeveloped in a not a residential, but in a form that would be consistent with the goals and objectives that are reflected in the city's Old Town Civic Center subarea plan for this area. There's just too many hurdles, and the cost to deal with that really doesn't make sense from a private sector standpoint economically to invest all those dollars, in the amount of developable land isn't all that significant based on the floodplain. The city's Old Town Civic Center subarea plan identifies the vast majority of the floodplain portion of this particular site, along with the floodplain portion of the adjacent properties that the city already owns to the north of this site, and some of the additional properties even north of the city's property being assembled and reused for some type of public open space, some type of public park along the river. It's unlikely that the private sector is going to make that happen without some significant city involvement. And then finally, last but not least, it's most likely, I should say, for the private sector to clean the property up to commercial standards. Again, that would be the most cost-effective way to clean it up, and that's really not even cleaning it up. It's leaving the contamination in place and leaving it covered, and then recording a land use restriction. If we were going to really clean up the property, most likely that would have required the city's involvement. So that's kind of the main whys the city was involved with the property back in 2006 and 2018. I think it's important to note that both last year's budget and the current year budget does include funding in the budget that could be used for, and it was specifically noted as being used for the possible acquisition and cleanup costs associated with this particular property. So I would just quickly want to walk through what it would take if somebody wanted to use the property in somewhat of an as-is situation. Certainly somebody would have to, if somebody was going to do that, they would definitely need to address the outstanding violation notices that have been issued by the Office of State Fire Marshal. At a minimum, that would involve the removal of 3 of the 4 tanks on the property, and upgrading the remaining tank that is more current in design with current spill detection upgrade, spill prevention upgrades, and then performing some leak detection testing on the existing tank to make sure that it's intact. They would also need to, well, I shouldn't say they would need to. The existing lust incident would not be the responsibility of a new property owner. That lust incident dates back to ConocoPhillips, and ConocoPhillips is the owner of record. They're the responsible party legally for that existing lust incident and getting that closed out. And they're working on closing it out to commercial standards. Again, that's to leave it in place and covered up, essentially. However, when the tanks that are on the property are removed, if there's any sign or indication of any contamination on the property, it could be some of the old contamination that was left on the property from way back when, could be new contamination. The state fire marshal's office would require that a new lust incident be created for that contamination. And if there's a new lust incident created, then the current, whoever owns the property when that's created, is then legally responsible for the current lust incident, the new lust incident, and making sure that gets closed out appropriately through the state's process. From a zoning perspective, the city would require that the property be used for either a permitted or special use in accordance with the city's existing B4 zoning classifications. If it's a special use, they would have to go through a public hearing process, and the city would need to approve the requisite special use permit. From a building code standpoint, whoever would be wanting to occupy any of the existing buildings on the property would need to apply for a certificate of occupancy with the Community Development Department. That would trigger a on-site inspection by both city and Warrenville Fire Protection District staff to ensure that the property was up to minimum life safety standards. And if not, then they would be required to apply for and secure permits to make the necessary revisions and upgrades to comply with those minimum life safety standards. Somebody would not have to bring the current buildings up to current city building codes, just minimum life safety standards, and deal with any maintenance issues that have been deferred over the last few years. And of course, if there's any signs that they want to install on the property, they need to get sign permits for that. From a stormwater management floodplain ordinance standpoint, I did want to point out that under the state of Illinois and the DuPage County stormwater management regulations, there is a cumulative amount of investment that can be made to the existing building, the convenience store building, that's in the floodplain under those ordinances. And basically, you can invest up to 50% of the existing value, market value of the building back into that building. And that's a cumulative threshold. So any type of maintenance, repair work that's done in the next year, that would be part of that 50%, and it would be the city's obligated by statutes to keep track of that. And once they meet 50%, could be 10, 15, 20 years from now, just repairing and maintaining it or making modifications to it, they then would be required to bring the building up to compliance with the current or then current floodplain and stormwater management ordinances, which means they would either have to flood-proof the building, demolish the building and rebuild it, or elevate the building, which are all complicated and costly things. But at least initially, they'd be able to use it in the floodplain somewhat as is. From a property maintenance code standpoint, the new owners would definitely need to address the remaining outstanding property maintenance and vacant building registration ordinance requirements that exist and apply to the property. They would also need to pay the outstanding property maintenance fines that have been assessed to the property and now represent a lien on the property. And those fines are just over $20,000, so that's not something to blink your eyes at. It's a significant amount of money. And of course, any business on the property would need to obtain a city business license. In contrast, redeveloping the property per the city's sub-area plan, which is, there's an illustration of the sub-area plan in the backup memo for tonight's meeting, and it involves the commercial use of the front portion of the property along Batavia Road, along in a kind of a coordinated manner with the adjacent city-owned properties to the north, the former Wangren and Johnson properties, and then along the eastern half or 2/3 of the property, it would be a combination of some parking that could be used to support the commercial uses and also provide parking for a public park that would eventually, or a public open space amenity that would evolve in the floodplain portion of the property. In order to make that all happen, they would need to remove somebody would need to remove all of the underground storage tanks on the property to address the Office of State Fire Marshal requirements. The existing Lust incident, that's really ConocoPhillips' responsibility, would need to be closed out to a residential standard, the higher level of standard, which would involve removal of contamination from the site rather than leaving it in place. If there's a new Lust incident that's created when the tanks are removed, that as well would need to be closed out to residential standards, not commercial standards, to redevelop it according to the sub-area plan. And then finally, there's been some environmental investigations, soil sampling that's been done on the property. There's been a lot, but some of that has confirmed that there is some heavy metal contamination on the property. So some of the soils have heavy metals in the soils that are at higher levels than what would allow it to be used for residential purposes or park purposes. So those contaminated soils of those areas of the site that would either be residential or park would have to be remediated appropriately also. From a zoning perspective, if the property was to be redeveloped, as it's currently illustrated in the city's sub-area plan, most likely that would require a public hearing and a planned unit development approval, where the city would be more flexible with the standard than we would be flexible in the application of our standard zoning regulations to allow and accommodate a type of land use and a form of development that would be more consistent with what you see in that area of town rather than what you typically see along a highway in a commercial setting. Most likely because of the extraordinary costs that would be involved in acquiring and cleaning up and redeveloping the property, given all the constraints that apply to it. And also understanding that we from the city's perspective want to see it redeveloped with the in a coordinated fashion with the adjacent Wanger and Johnson property. Most likely there would be some type of redevelopment city assistance agreement that would be requested and then have to be negotiated between the city and any private party that would be involved in that activity. From a building site improvement standpoint, there would be all the existing improvements would need to be demolished and new permits issued for any new construction on the property. From a stormwater management floodplain perspective, any new improvements would have to comply 100% with the current stormwater management and floodplain regulations, including the implementation of best management practices to filter any runoff that might come from the property. However, because of the amount of impervious area on the properties right now, it's unlikely that any new detention requirements would be triggered. From a property maintenance standpoint, I think the demolition of the existing improvements to accommodate redevelopment would take care of the property maintenance code violations. That being said, there would still be the outstanding lien that would be need to be dealt with. And then, of course, the business licenses for any new businesses that would be located on the property. Which leads me to, if there's any questions on any of the information in the agenda backup or that I've delivered verbally here tonight, I'll be happy to try to address those. But just as important is identifying if there's any specific additional pieces of information that the City Council would like staff to prepare and assemble for the recommended closed session discussion.
Thank you, Director Menser. Are there any questions? Alderman Berry.
I see from the pictures here, and also I drive by there to go to work at 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, and there's cars constantly parked in this gas station. I know that, I can understand in the evening when I come home that people probably, if there's no room to park for the pizza, for Al's Pizza, you know, several people park over there. But at 8 o'clock in the morning, now there's semis parked in this parking lot. They were there last week and the week before, I think. Is there any way to stop this from happening, that we can get the owner to rope off their property or put chains across the entryways into the property? Because it's starting to look like a junkyard, really.
I don't know that there's a easy solution for that, because part of the property, the very east edge of the property, is kind of a shared driveway easement that provides access to the Voltel's back kind of storage area. So trying to rope that off would certainly restrict their access to their back area. And I think if it's left open, then it invites other people to get in on the property. Closing off the other driveways with some kind of temporary restriction is not something that we've had any discussion with the current property owners on, but based on the discussions we've had with them, they don't seem to want to spend any money or real significant effort on dealing with this particular property any more than we forced them to. We could certainly have a conversation with the city attorney to see if they have any creative ideas that we can explore further to prevent unauthorized vehicles from parking on the property.
Yeah, because I know even in Emerald Green, if you park there for an extended period of time and you don't live there, we have the right to tow your car. And I don't understand why they don't even have a sign up that says, you know, that violators would be towed. They're not responsible for paying for that. The person who gets towed pays for that. So at least if they could put something up like that, I think that might at least deter some of these cars and semis, trucks from parking there. But the whole corner is starting to look like just a junkyard with all these cars parked there. And also, they have several streetlights that are not working, that have been torn down or something.
Yeah, that's the streetlights. The decorative streetlights are one of the remaining outstanding property maintenance code violations that they haven't addressed, that they still need to address.
Okay, thank you.
Just to follow up on that quickly, because there are unaddressed outstanding code enforcement issues and further violations that are continuing, I know we have a lien on the property, but do any of the fines continue to accrue?
We have to go take it back through the adjudication process. So at some point, yeah, they're open violation notices, but we would need to go back to the adjudication process, and the adjudication hearing officer would need to assess another round of fines, you might say.
Okay, but in theory, we have the right to do that because
Oh, yeah,
we still aren't
yeah.
in compliance, and many of these fines accrue per day.
Yes, that's how they accrued to $21,000, because there were multiple violations, and accruing for a period of months, it adds up quickly.
Okay, so the sooner they can get our code violations addressed, the better for them.
You would think so.
You would think, yes. Okay, Alderman Davalos, I think you had your hand up.
Thank you. So can you just help me understand Conoco's responsibility? So I understand they're responsible, but they're saying that the extent of their responsibility is just to re-asphalt over. They're not going to take anything out. There's no requirement by the state that they remove anything.
Yeah, so they've submitted a proposed remediation action plan that's been approved by the state of Illinois. And that approved plan calls for whatever's left in terms of contamination to remain on site in place, and the property owner just maintaining some type of impervious cover over it. So whether that's asphalt or concrete or, whatever. Right now it's asphalt and concrete. If they, chose to tear that out and put it all asphalt, they could do that conceivably. But a key component of that is that they need to record a land use restriction against the property, both the property where the contamination is, that would prevent it from being used for residential uses, which includes open space. They also need to have DuPage County approve a, I can't remember the acronym, but it basically is an acknowledgement by the county that there's contamination in the soil in the adjacent public right-of-way of Warrenville Road, that the county's okay with it being left there. And then finally, they need to obtain a land use restriction covenant approval from the adjacent owner of, I'll call it the Votel property, that also says that, you know, the contamination that's migrated onto that property can stay in place, and any future land use of that property would be restricted to commercial type land uses and wouldn't be allowed to be used for any type of residential or residential or public open space.
So what do you think the chances are Conoco's going to do any of this stuff? I mean,
Well, I think
is anybody holding them accountable?
I think that the challenge is them. They've had struggles in struggles. Maybe that's not the best description. They have not been able to come to agreement with the owners of the Votel property on putting the restriction on their property that says, hey, well, you know, the contamination that's there can stay in place.
Okay, so regardless of that, the underground tanks, except for the one that might stay underground, the 3 will have to be removed by whoever buys this property.
Yes, the tanks will have to be removed. They're condemned, and at some point, the Office of State Fire Marshal will get around, and the Attorney General's office will get around to enforcing that.
Okay, and so, so this auction coming up for this land, are we pretty clear that all this information is going to be upfront with the people buying this are going to obviously know the all the different things that are going to have to be dealt with, right?
We've communicated all of this information to the individual or the firm that's auctioning the property, and the principal in that firm is the one I've been dealing with, talking with directly, both on the phone and via email. It's my understanding that he's a licensed real estate broker, and under the licensure laws of Illinois, he's required to disclose that information. He's acknowledged that to me on the phone, that they will have to disclose all the information. His firm will have to disclose all the information that I provided to him about the property and the current situation. Whether I don't know, you know, I can't, he's
Right.
required to, but I don't know how effective he'll be in doing that.
So is there any state funding, this LUST program, or somehow, any state funding to help get rid of these tanks? Is there, not that it would be easy or timely, but,
The LUST program is the Leaking Underground Storage Tank Program under the IEPA, and that program is a program that is a funded program, which when I mean by funded means that there is monies available and budgeted each year in the state budget. And those monies actually come from every time somebody buys a gallon of gas. Part of the taxes on that gas are directed towards the Leaking Underground Storage Tank program. So it's a reimbursable program. So somebody would need to deal with the removal of the contamination on the property and all the consulting costs that go along with that, and then submit for reimbursement through the program. There's approximately $1.5 million worth of funding of LUST funding that's been earmarked for this particular property, for the existing contamination that's on the property and known as part of the 1997 LUST incident that's open. So yes, there is. The short answer is there's a program in place, but it still requires that somebody spend the money up front and then submit for reimbursement after the fact. And knowing the state, it's probably a relatively complicated, time-consuming process, and you're probably not going to get all of your money back. You might get 80 to 90% of it.
and so what part of any of this would be TIF eligible, any of it? Or do we even know if
Well,
in the end, some of those
property-
TIF funds.
Property acquisitions, TIF eligible, dealing, cleaning up, performing cleanup, and the consulting costs going that are associated with cleaning up property, that's all stuff that is specifically allowed as TIF eligible costs.
Thank you.
Alderman Weidner was next.
Thank you. I have a couple different questions. One, can you remind me of the timing and the process that we'd have to go through in order to change it from a B4 to a zoning classification to something that might be more appropriate?
Well, we have existing zoning classifications that we could apply to the property. Historically, the city hasn't rezoned properties, self-initiated the rezoning of private properties, and you'd have to make a case why that rezoning is consistent with the city's, approval criteria for rezoning. Most cases, municipalities don't proactively rezone property or downzone property because there most likely could be an argument made that you're taking away value of the property. So now it's a much easier case if you own the property and you decide to rezone it, then it's a public hearing process to rezone it to a different classification. But if the city owned it, we would market it like a piece of property and just suggest that it would need to, or dictate that it would need to be done as a planned unit development. So we would have more control over the details of the form and type of land uses that would ultimately end up on that property, rather than just rezoning it to a standard zoning classification that may or may not work for a creative type development that's consistent with what our goals are for the area.
Thank you. Besides the city of Warrenville and the LUST program, are there any other agencies, government agencies that would be able to help with either enforcement of the outstanding issues or funding of the cleanup?
I don't know that there's any other agencies that are available and willing and prepared to step up and help deal with the enforcement issues. I think it's the city and the state, and the state is, it's just not a high priority for them. I don't know how else to say it more bluntly. It's just down on their list. From a funding standpoint, there are a couple of additional funding opportunities that could be explored. ConocoPhillips, and the conversations that I've had with them, and the city's had past dealings with ConocoPhillips. We, as part of the existing LUST incident, we worked with ConocoPhillips jointly, and ConocoPhillips, instead of moving the former private well on the Al's Pizza Town Tap property further away from the contamination, just moving it, they worked with the city, and we extended a water main to connect that property to a water main, and they actually contributed more funds towards that water main project than what it would have cost them to relocate the well on the property. So they've got a track record of working with the city to help accomplish things that might be more appropriate and desirable from the community's perspective on these types of issues, these outstanding issues. And in the conversations that I've had with the project manager that's assigned to this project, this particular property, and she's been there for a long time. She was involved with the water main extension and connecting the town tap to that water main project. She's indicated they might be willing to provide some funding over and above what they would normally spend just to leave the stuff in place if it was going to help get this off their books. Because right now it's just languishing out there. They got to deal with it on a regular basis. There's quote unquote carrying costs to deal with that. They have to have consultants on the payroll to deal with it and file the necessary paperwork with the state. So there might be some funding there. I don't want to represent that it would be anything significant. And then there's another source of funding that we could explore. You may recall that when the city worked with DuPage County Stormwater on the relocation, remeandering of the river, reconstruction of the Warrenville Road Bridge, there was a memorandum of understanding that the county executed and provided to the city, and they pledged that as their finances permit, they would make, I can't remember what the number was, but it was a fairly significant number. It was well over $100,000 available to help support the city's acquisition of any of the properties that are in the floodplain down there. Again, it's subject to them having the money available to do that. So in the past, we've reached out to them a couple years back, I think when we were discussing it in 2016 with the city council, and they said at that point in time they didn't have the financial resources. They were actually waiting to be reimbursed from the state of Illinois for the acquisition of the former Source One building that got torn down to accommodate the river meandering building. So I don't know if they've been reimbursed by the state, but that's what they were thinking. They were going to use the money that they were reimbursed by the state to kind of reinvest it and remove other things that were in the floodplain.
Yeah, with the river had so many different participating government agencies, it really made that whole effort stronger in the effort to clean the thorium out of the river, which was eventually accomplished for millions of dollars. And I just wonder if there's any way that we could, further enlist DuPage County. I don't think we would have any neighboring communities that would be able to be involved with this, but I would think that it'd be worthwhile to tap into DuPage County, to see if that were possible. And then somehow there's just so many enforcement issues. If there's any way that we can escalate or, promote the fact that there's been an absolute ignoring of the city and its attempts to provide a healthy environment for its residents, on behalf of the county or on behalf of the owners of that property. It's just like they, have left this blighted condition in this middle of the city at the gateway to our city without accepting any responsibility and totally ignoring, the ordinances and the fines and the actions that they are supposed to be legally, obliged to follow. And I wonder if is there any hope in the Attorney General getting involved? I mean, it's been a year since they've had that on their, or more, since they've had that on their desk, and I just wonder whether or not we can inspire, any kind of communication or enforcement action on the part of the Attorney General, too.
The last conversation I've had with the Attorney General's office was probably last August, September, and I didn't get a whole lot of encouragement, but I can certainly follow up and have another conversation and find out what the current status, if anything's changed.
And then, I don't know, when all else fails, it makes me react, as a, kind of a defensive citizen about my town when somebody is like refusing to do anything. And it just, you wonder whether the city ought to take action to, it's not like you'd be providing eminent domain action against a citizen or a resident. It'd be against a commercial entity. But, for us to be treated like this for years and not have any kind of strong reaction about, wanting to have a healthy environment. I mean, we spent millions of dollars on the DuPage River. We have, the civic property where we're now building homes cleaned up. This is the last remaining site. I just think that we ought to, try everything, that we can to, clean this place up for our residents. It's an embarrassment, I think, to have that in the state and condition above ground the way it looks, and we can only imagine what's underground and what that looks like. And I just think that we really ought to apply all efforts we possibly can to solve and remediate that situation. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Alderman Krischel next.
Thank you. Is there any way to estimate kind of the level of contamination? Because I think that's the biggest variable here. Is there any way to be able to tell that?
In terms of like estimated from a dollar standpoint of what it would cost to clean it up?
Yeah, both. From an
Yeah.
area standpoint as well as a dollar amount?
Well, there's been an enormous amount of soil testing done on the site, so we have a pretty good understanding of the scope of contamination, geographically, you might say, on the site, and the type of contamination that would need to be dealt with depending on what type of land use. We do have some estimates that are, I'll call them order of magnitude type estimates that I can provide. I don't remember what they are off the top of my head, but I can certainly provide that information going forward.
Okay, yeah, I know that in the budget we had, I think it was $570,000 for 2020 for the purchase as well as the remediation, and I'm just wondering, if that's in scope. I mean, that's a huge variable of something that we don't know, and I'd hate to get wrapped up into something that is a lot larger than we had anticipated. So, thank you.
Right, I think my comment on that is that was based upon a letter of intent that ended up falling through. Right, I think that number came from those negotiations over the last couple of years with the current property owner, and that number wasn't intended to convey the total amount to clean up because the property owner was going to be paying for some of that. Just my recollection off the top of my head. Alderman Davalos, or were you done? Yes, okay. I'll go into Alderman Davalos next.
Right, so back to what we're being asked to do. I just want to, in light of all the comments that have been made, I would like to vote yes on bringing this to a closed session. I think there's a lot we have to discuss and figure out and talk about. And as Alderman Widener said, this is a gateway place. I can just see this is only going to go downhill here. I just don't see how it gets better. So there's a lot of discussion that needs to be had, so I would be in favor of that. Okay. I'd like to make a motion. I have to see exactly what we're asking for here. I'd like to make a motion to direct staff to include a closed session discussion regarding the city's potential acquisition of the former Citgo gas station property located at 28W244 Warrenville Road on the June 3rd, 2019 City Council agenda.
Motion by Alderman Barry, second by Alderman Wilson, or no, motion by Alderman Davalos, second by Alderman Barry or Wilson, whichever you prefer. All right, any further discussion? I don't think you were raising your hand. Okay. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
Motion carries. We are jumping ahead now to item number 10 on the agenda so that we can get Detective Pasiak through here. The item is consideration to appoint Robert Miller to the position of Warrenville Emergency Management Agency Assistant Coordinator. Chief Toronto or Detective Pasiak, either one.
Thank you, Chairman. On May 14th, we received a letter from our current Emergency Management Agency Assistant Coordinator, Mr. Detweiler, indicating that due to career responsibilities, he would have to step down from this Assistant Coordinator position. However, he does want to remain in the position of a volunteer. EMA Coordinator Pasiak discussed this with me. His recommendation was that Mr. Robert Miller, he's a current EMA volunteer, would be tapped to fill that vacant Assistant Coordinator position. Included in the agenda backup material is Mr. Miller's resume, as well as his letter of interest in this position. This was brought to the attention of Mayor Brummel, since this is a mayoral appointment, and Mayor Brummel indicated he had no problem with this. At this point, the staff would be looking for a recommendation to the City Council to approve the appointment of Mr. Miller to the position of a Emergency Management Agency Assistant Coordinator. And Detective Pasiak is here if there's any questions that you have specifically as far as the position or what it entails.
Thank you. Are there any questions about what the position entails? What does the position entail? Since that begs the question.
Hear me? Okay. The position entails being basically available 24/7. That person is issued a city telephone should the need arise to help coordinate efforts if an emergency should happen. And Mr. Detweiler's current position doesn't allow him to have a second telephone with him or answer any type of calls that would take him away from his current responsibilities. And he brought it to my attention, and it was something he was thinking about. So, I have to be able to get a hold of the assistant coordinator, and I have to be able to have someone to assist me coordinate if an emergency happens, and it just wasn't in the cards. So I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Okay, well, please convey our thanks to Mr. Detweiler for his volunteering, and also to Mr. Miller for being willing to step forward when we need somebody for this.
I will.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. All right, anybody want to make a motion? Alderman Weidner.
I move to recommend the city council approve the appointment of Robert Miller to the position of the Warrenville Emergency Management Agency Assistant Coordinator.
Second.
Motion by Alderman Weidner, second by Alderman Wilson. Further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much, Detective Pasiak. All right, we're jumping back to item number 2 on the agenda. The consideration of the general loss control procedures. We will go to Assistant City Administrator White.
Thank you. Before I get into the policy that you're reviewing tonight, I did want to point out that there is an error in the agenda. F2 states that we're reviewing 3 policies. That is not correct. We're only looking at one tonight, the general loss control procedures. It is accurate in the summary, the motion that's in the summary, and the backup material. So with that, the Safety Committee, as you know, has been reviewing our safety policies and making recommendations to amend the safety policies, which will eventually be incorporated into a safety manual update. Previously, the City Council has adopted the Safety Committee policy, the inspections policy, and a slip, trip, and fall policy. The General Loss Control Procedures policy basically describes the city's safety and loss control program and provides for general responsibilities on behalf of the city to the loss control program. This is one of many policies. We'll have additional policies again to review in the future at another committee meeting. And with that, I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Alderman Weidner.
Seems like a safe motion to make. I move to recommend the city council adopt the general loss control procedures policy effective immediately.
Second.
Motion by Alderman Weidner, second by Alderman Davalos. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Moving on to item number 3, the consideration to dispose of certain IT-related property. Again, Assistant City Administrator White.
Thank you. Included with the agenda backup is an ordinance authorizing disposal of city property and an Exhibit A, which is effectively a list of a variety of IT equipment that has been accumulated since the last disposal ordinance was approved by the city back in 2017. This equipment is no longer serves a purpose. It either does not work or has been replaced with updated or new technology. It's all been wiped by our IT people, AIS, to make sure that the city's information is secure and not accessible to the public when it's recycled. And staff is recommending that we recycle the items through a company called eScrap Technologies Incorporated. They're located in Bolingbrook. We've used them in the past. Their goal is to fully recycle or refurbish the equipment so that it doesn't end up in a landfill. So they offer pickup service at no cost to the city, which eliminates the need for city staff to take the equipment somewhere and spend the time and resources to do that, which is also a bonus for us. And with that, I would entertain any questions.
Okay, and this is all things that have reached the end of their life cycle, no further resale value or any purpose to keeping it.
That's correct. It's all end of life. And again, some of it doesn't work. Some of it, we've eliminated or removed pieces when there was something that wasn't working. We were able to pull out a hard drive from one computer and put it into a different one. So it's incomplete equipment. Yeah, there's a variety of extra pieces and parts and accessories and cords.
But it's great we're able to scrap and recycle it and not just throw it away. That's wonderful. All right, any questions? Alderman Krischel.
Do we get a certificate of data destruction from our consultants? Or can
From our IT consultants?
Yes.
We have not, but I can request that from them.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Any other questions or comments or a motion? Alderman Weidner?
Yeah, with Alderman Kressel's recommendation, I move to recommend the city council authorize the disposal of city property as listed utilizing eScrap Technologies Incorporated.
Second.
Motion by Alderman Weidner, second by Alderman Davalos. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right. More city property to dispose of. Consideration of a request to dispose of surplus city property, which is broken equipment. Chief Toronto.
Thank you. Before you is a list of exhibits that is in the possession of the police department. It is city property, but it is no longer functioning. It's either broken or outdated equipment that would not be eligible for repair because of the lack of availability of parts or the date of the equipment being so old it wouldn't be feasible to invest the money in it. Additionally, because this is non-functioning property, it would not be accepted for resale by our usual auction vendor, which is propertyroom.com. The items have been listed in furnishes with Exhibit A, and you'll see it's a time-lapse VHS video viewer, a Sony color printer, packages of paper film, etc. On the advice of the city attorney, ordinance was drafted that would allow for the disposal of this. And what we will do when it's going to be disposed of is to try and dispose and recycle as much as we can of this as either scrap metal or in electronic recycling. The rest of it would be discarded through the city's regular waste collection service. And if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer those for you.
Any questions? And the ordinance has been drafted so that staff can recycle as much as possible and only throw away that which we can't dispose of otherwise. I would entertain a motion. Alderman Berry.
I'd like to make a motion to recommend the city council approve an ordinance or authorizing the disposal of city-owned property through the metal scrapping, electronic recycling, or the city's regular waste collection service.
Second.
Motion by Alderman Berry, second by Alderman Davalos. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Item number 5 is the consideration of a request to dispose of additional surplus city property. This case involves radars. Chief Toronto.
Thank you. Currently, we have 5 mobile radar units in our possession. These have been rotated out of service. They've had a service life in excess of 10 years, and we've replaced them with new units that we have purchased through budgeted funds. They were rotated out of service due to their being broken, their age of service, and also due to the factors that they've been not recommended for repair because of lack of availability of parts or the cost incurred. Our current radar vendor, which is RadarMan Incorporated, has requested to take the out-of-service mobile radar units in exchange for an open-ended account credit. This would be applied when we either have to purchase a radar unit in the future or when we have to have our annual recertification of our radar units. Upon inspection, they indicated they would give us between $500 and $1,000 total which could be applied towards either a purchase or the recertification. It's anticipated the credit amount would be used within 1 year's time period because of the annual recertification. And there's also an inventory listing the items that are to be disposed of, the radar units. So if I have any questions that I can answer for you, I'd be happy to do so.
Okay, so we buy the units and have them recertified by the same vendor, and we know what the annual costs will be of having them recertified, so we can tell right now that this credit would be about less than the next known annual cost.
That's correct.
Okay. That's very clear. Any questions? Comments, motions? Alderman Berry.
I'd like to make a motion to recommend the city council approve an ordinance authorizing the disposal of surplus city-owned property through exchange of said property with Radar Man Incorporated for future city purchase credit.
Motion by Alderman Berry, second by Alderman Wilson. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Chief. Moving on to item number 6, the consideration of an ordinance to amend Title 5, Chapter 3, Section 11, the removal of vehicles of the city code. And this goes along with item 7, but we'll just talk about 6 first. Chief Turano.
Thank you. Item number 6 revolves around the fact that in the fall of 2018, we encountered an incident where we had a large semi-tractor trailer drive off of Route 59, positioned itself where it was obstructing a lane of traffic, and also we had to use specialized equipment because of the size and weight of this vehicle to be able to remove it from that location. There were only 2 companies that had this type of equipment, and that was specifically called a rotator. When we removed this item, we found that in our code, there wasn't any specificity that said that the city had the right to remove these vehicles and that the cost would fall on the owner or the company that owned the vehicle. Because of the specialized nature of this equipment, the amount that was given to the individual, the bill when it was tendered, it was tens of thousands of dollars because it was out there for about 6 hours to try and move this. And what a rotator looks like essentially is it rotates, and it's essentially like a crane that has an arm that goes over, and it hooks onto like the trailer portion of the vehicle and is able to lift it and then reposition it. So again, there was only 2 companies in the northern area of Illinois that would be in proximity for us to use. So in consulting with the city attorney, we reviewed the ordinance, and a draft ordinance was recommended, and it was adding a section D indicating vehicles creating a traffic hazard. And that's included as part of the backup agenda material, and specifically the language in that draft given by the city attorney indicates that the city and the police department has a right to remove any vehicle in an expeditious manner that would pose a safety hazard to other traffic, pedestrians, or people in the area, and that any type of costs incurred in this would be borne by the owner of the property. And it was the recommendation that the fee section and then the part that we're discussing right now being the removal of the vehicles be addressed in 2 separate issues, and I'll explain why when we get to the next item. So that's what's been tendered before the council, along with a sample of the draft ordinance in the backup agenda, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer those for you.
Thank you, Chief. And just my own note to clear up any possible confusion, the memo and the ordinance, I believe, are in the packet twice. So if anybody turned the page and saw the same thing again and was confused, the whole thing seems to be in the packet twice. Any questions or comments? Alderman Wilson.
I'd like to make a recommendation that the City Council will approve the proposed amendment to Title V, Chapter 3, Section 11, removal of vehicles to include Section D, vehicles creating traffic hazards.
Second.
Motion by Alderman Wilson, second by Alderman Davalos. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? And the motion carries. Back to you, Chief, on the consideration of a request to adopt a fee schedule for the same Title V, Chapter 3, Section 11, removal of vehicles of the city code.
Thank you, Chairman. If you see in the backup agenda material, and again, this came out of the last incident when we were dealing with this this semi-tractor trailer, and it was a unique situations that we don't encounter often, but it does happen from time to time. And on the advice of the city attorney, we were instructed or was advised that we obtain the vehicle tow rates for light duty, and a light duty vehicle is described as a vehicle up to 10,000 pounds of gross vehicle weight, and then a heavy duty vehicle is anything over 10,000 pounds. So on our authorized tow list that we have for the city, we had the rates given to us by the agencies that respond to the calls for police towing, and that was from B&L Towing and NAR Towing and O'Hare Towing. And we compiled a list, and if you'll see, there is a list of the tow fee schedules. And it would be, again, for the two classifications, one for light-duty vehicles and another for heavy-duty. A basic tow for a light-duty vehicle is $150. There's an administrative fee. Then if you have specialty things that are needed, if you'd have to winch the vehicle, if you'd have to winch it and tow it, sometimes with winching you just have to pull it out of a ditch. If the wheels are flat or the axle's broken or something, you'd have to winch it and tow it. Then there's for cleanup, and that's anytime on the roadway, if there's oil, glass, transmission fluid, that type of thing. But if you can see, all these fees are listed here. And on the advice of the city attorney, we did it in two separate issues because this is reviewed by us biannually. So what we will do is every 2 years when we review these costs, we'll get a submission from our authorized tow companies, and we can submit that for approval, and we don't have to amend the whole ordinance. It would just be the fee schedule. And you have those schedules in front of you, again, as part of the backup agenda material, and I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have those.
Thank you. I do have one question, which is I know that Finance is working on putting together a grouping of fee schedules. So is this already sort of part of that grouping, or is
Yes.
this going to be listed separately?
Yeah, I wanted to do this just for clarity so that you could see it was our different tow operators that are on call by the city, or not employed by the city, but they have agreed to be on call when we call. And they have to get there within a specified, I believe it's within 20 minutes time period, and, handle the tows for us, so.
That's very convenient. Okay, thank you. Any questions or comments? Alderman Wilson.
I'd like to make a recommend the city council adopt a fee schedule for light and heavy-duty vehicle removal.
Second.
Motion by Alderman Wilson, second by Alderman Davalos. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right, moving right along. Item number 8, a consideration of an ordinance to amend Title II, Chapter 4, Section 13, the volunteer member requirements of the City Code. Chief Toronto.
Thank you, Chairman. I may employ some assistance from my colleague, the Assistant City Administrator, on this. But basically, in a review of the ordinances that we do with our city attorney, it was the recommendation that we specifically delineate the word volunteer, and we use that and clean up some of the language in the EMA ordinance so that there would be no confusion as to the person being classified as a volunteer, and it couldn't be misconstrued as them being thought of as an employee of the city. And there was a draft ordinance that was prepared and submitted by the city attorney that was included in the agenda backup material. And if there's any questions that you have, or if I wasn't clear on that definition, I'd be happy to clear that up for you.
Assistant City Administrator White.
Thank you. Detective Pasiak and I, who's also the EMA coordinator, and I have been discussing some revisions to the EMA policies and procedures and training for the EMA volunteers. And so as part of that, I did enlist the help of our labor attorneys to review the ordinance and some of the supplementary information that we provide to the EMA volunteers. And this was their suggestion to remove Section J from the ordinance because a probationary period lends itself to an employment relationship and not a strict volunteer relationship, which is always at will. A volunteer can leave at any time. The city can remove them from service at any time for any reason. And so they recommended that we clean up this ordinance to make sure that there was no confusion and potential interpretation of the EMA volunteers as an employee with the city.
Very logical. Thank you. Any questions? Alderman Widener.
Motion to recommend the city council approve the proposed amendments to Title II, Chapter 4, Emergency Management Agency to update current language.
Second.
Motion by Alderman Widener, second by Alderman Davalos. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Moving right along. Item number 9 is the consideration of the contract renewal for our city prosecutor services from Christine Charkowitz. Chief Toronto.
Thank you. Ms. Sharkowitz has been our city prosecutor for local ordinance violations that are handled in field court as well as traffic citations. She served in that capacity since April of 2015 and does an excellent job for us. In the contract that she submitted to us for proposed renewal, there was a $10 increase for her proposed hourly rate for a court session, which occurs 4 times a month. The old rate was $180, the new rate would be $190. All of the other work that she does for the city as far as routine phone calls from the officers, if a court session extends beyond 2 hours, there's no charge for that. All the other research issues and what she handles for code enforcement remains the same. So it's just a $10 increase for her court appearances.
Okay, just to correct something you just said, I think you said her hourly rate was going up, but it's her per session.
Session rate, excuse me.
That's right, because it's 2 hours, so.
Correct.
But if there is a session that goes longer than 2 hours, the
There's no charge.
contract says she won't charge us. So
Correct.
that's wonderful. And otherwise, the contract is the same as we have approved in the past.
Yes.
All right, any questions or comments or a motion? Alderman Berry.
I'd like to make a motion to recommend the city council approve the contract renewal for city prosecutor services with attorney Christine Charkowitz for the period of June 1, 2019 through May 31, 2020.
Second.
Motion by Alderman Berry, second by Alderman Davalos. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. And we've already covered item 10, so we're skipping right ahead to item 11. The consideration of an amendment to the City Code, Title IV, Chapter 6, regarding fireworks permits for display of consumer fireworks or pyrotechnic fireworks within the city limits. City Administrator Coakley.
Thank you. This relates to something that has actually been in existence for about 2 decades. It was most recently amended in 2006. The city requirements for a public fireworks display permit that would apply to any private or public. The only one that we have historically in Warrenville is the 4th of July fireworks display, but there are others that could be allowed under the code. The State Fire Marshal's Office requires under the state statute that local jurisdictions issue permits, and there's certain requirements that have to be met to get those permits for a fireworks or pyrotechnics display. One of them is that the chief fire official, the fire district chief in our case, must also issue a permit that the fire district board does review and approve. The city is also required to issue a permit. However, historically, for some reason, we have never actually physically, the council has approved a permit annually, but not actually issued a permit. Upon review of our procedures after the 2018 fireworks, I want to say incident, it wasn't an incident, thank God. Because of the storm and the weather, they had to delay the fireworks because of the events that occurred. We were reviewing our procedures, realized there is no actual city permit, although the council approves one. Therefore, I had been talking to the city attorney's office last summer about creating a permit, and while she was working on creating the permit form in advance of this 4th of July, she realized there's several things that the city code would need to be amended, amendments to the city code to make our process work. The primary change to the city code that's recommended, and there is a draft ordinance that is marked up with the changes, would enable the city would issue the permit, and instead of having to have the fire district chief sign the city's permit, which is administratively difficult, it would simply accept the fire district's permit that the chief would sign, fire chief, and that would be accepted as a signature of the fire official on our permit. It's a simple administrative function, but it makes it a lot easier to administer. So there'd be 2 permits that are issued, and then there are some other, if anyone is interested, there's other requirements. The fire officials do go out and inspect the site before they can even be fired off to make sure that they're all set up and done right. That is certainly under the fire district's purview. You want the fire officials doing that kind of inspection. So unless there's some questions, the permit form is included here. It doesn't need to be approved because it's simply an administrative form that documents what the ordinance has already been approved for. The city code amendments would need to be done to be approved or recommended by the committee to the council so that we can go ahead and make those changes to our code and make it efficient. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
All right, so it's just an administrative form that documents our code, and we're not approving the form, just the code.
Correct.
Gotcha. Any comments or questions? Alderman Berry.
I'd like to make a motion to recommend the city council pass an ordinance amending the city code Title 4, Chapter 6 regarding pyrotechnic display permits.
I'll second, but we have a question.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Further discussion. Alderman Wilson.
Yeah, where are the indoor displays held?
City Administrator.
It says here, all indoor Polytech displays shall be conducted in buildings. I just wondering, where are they held?
Currently, there are none, but the code and the state law does allow for such. It's not, my first thought was the same as I think you're thinking by the expression you have. It's not the kind that we see at the 4th of July, but it might be some small pyrotechnics display with a concert or a band. They may have some kind of
Summer days could have something.
it could be at other things, but indoors might be something where there'd be, I'd call them large sparklers, things that were shooting off flares or something inside. And you want to make sure that that's regulated because the buildings have to be prepared for that. They need sprinkler systems. The fire district would be inspecting those, that kind of thing. Currently, there are none, but someone could apply for it in such a capacity.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I don't feel very eager to see a lot of that come to Warrenville. Sounds kind of dangerous. Well, I guess you just never know if it's done properly. All right, any comments, questions? We've already got a motion on the floor by Alderman Berry and a second by Alderman Widener. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Okay, moving on to item number 12, the review of the strategic plan updates on public safety, fiscal conservatism, and city infrastructure goals. I will go to Assistant City Administrator White.
Thank you. As promised, city staff has been dedicating a portion of our senior staff meetings every week to review the goals and objectives of the 2015 strategic plan. The focus of staff's review has been to determine what action steps have been taken towards those objectives, what action steps are proposed to be taken, if any. Included in the backup are progress reports for 3 of the strategic plan goals. This is not all of them. Staff is still working through some of the strategic plan goals, but we wanted to bring forward the ones that we have completed. which include, again, fiscal conservatism, city infrastructure, and public safety. On each of the status reports, the individual objectives for each goal are listed with a color-coded status. Green indicates that the items are completed or the objective as a whole is completed. The orange indicates it's an ongoing or in-progress objective, and red indicates that it's been placed on hold. The year in parentheses at the end of each action step taken is there to delineate that that item has been completed and when it was completed. The year or date that's included as part of the proposed action steps is when staff anticipates beginning that item. Where applicable, the items also include some notations if there is a hold on a specific action step within an objective. That's also noted within the context. In addition to obviously your feedback or discussion on the items and the objectives, we're also open to feedback on the format and layout of these reports, and if there's anything that would be helpful for the council. Eventually, once all of these reports are completed for all the strategic plan goal objectives, we intend to post these on the city website as a public update to the strategic plan goals. And with that, City Administrator Coakley and I can answer the questions that you may have about the specific items, and if there's anything that requires city staff input, if they're not here, we can certainly follow up with them and give you those answers at a later time.
Thank you. Alderman Davalos.
Yeah, just a little drill down on the public safety goal number 5, just so I understand the timeline. So it says here, when it talks about winter 2019 to 2020, does that mean something's beginning? It began already?
No.
Or it's going to be continuing through that time period?
Right, so under proposed action steps where it indicates winter 2019, 2020, that's the anticipated start time, which would be this upcoming winter season 2019 into 2020, which would be next year as a start. Does that answer the
So
question?
winter 2019 is past. I mean, we're in spring, right? So I just need to understand because it's just me.
No, we went through this, I'm smiling because we went through this discussion during the staff meeting as well. So what we took to be winter 2019 is because the winter technically starts in December of each year. December 2019 would be the end or beginning of winter for this upcoming season, and then into the January, February months of 2020. So that is the time period we're referring to, not this past winter.
Okay, December begins.
Correct.
Okay. And this is a realistic time frame because I'm pretty interested in this. I'm very interested in this goal.
Yeah, so I believe you're speaking specifically about the rental registration and inspection program.
Yes.
Community development staff has started to work through outlining what that process and that those policies and procedures may look like as part of the Mazik City ERP implementation. With that, we've created sort of a basic framework. There's a lot more that needs to be done from a public communication standpoint, getting proper approvals from the council about the program as a whole and how we're going to roll out the program. So there's still quite a bit of work to do, but Community and Economic Development Director Mentzer felt that those were realistic time periods to start working through the rest of those options and decisions to bring forward something to the City Council for approval in terms of a program. The crime-free housing portion will be, as you can see, is kind of on hold at this point because that's a very involved process, and he felt that we needed to start with a registration program before we get into the crime-free housing side of it. And I'm probably not doing it justice, and if you were here, probably would provide a lot more detail, but
I think it's a great start. I think it's good just to have it down here on paper and have a commitment started. Thank you.
Thank you. My feedback, since you're requesting it, is just put months. You know, it can be approximate, put an approximately equal sign if you want in November of 19 or whatever.
Okay.
Months would help. It would be clearer, yes. I think just on the subject of putting in dates in terms of feedback as to the format of this, I think because some of these things are very much ongoing items, it's going to be difficult just practically to read through it if you end up having to sort of parentheses all the updates one after another as ongoing things continue. So the whole status, this is an ongoing objective at the bottom isn't maybe the best format. I'm not sure what else to suggest, but I can consider a future iteration of this document in a year or two and how unwieldy that might get after a little while.
Okay.
So just to break up the status bit more within the different steps instead of just one at the end, perhaps. I'm not sure if that would solve it in all of these cases because some of these items are just, continue producing work plans every year. Well, yes, we're going to try and do that every year. So, but then one of the problems is that the scope of many of our different strategic plans goals are very different. Some are very big and some are very detailed, and so checking things off for some items is possible and really not for others. Do you have a timeline projected for when we might get an update on items 1, 3, and 6, since we've got 2, 4, and 5 here?
That will likely happen with the next Public Safety and Finance Committee meeting in July. We are close to wrapping up the final 3, but the last remaining one is the biggest, which is economic development. That had several objectives listed under it that we need to go through. That's anticipated to continue into and through June, and if all goes well and we can wrap up all of the action items and potential future action items, we'll have it for you at the next public safety meeting.
Okay, I was surprised 6 wasn't on here because I know some of those things are very minute, and there's a lot of small little details in item 6. So
It's
it was
very
surprising that
complex.
wasn't here because is there a whole lot? Well, maybe there is. You'll tell us about it then. I can't wait.
Yes.
Further comments or questions? The strategic plan, it's nice to see some action steps worked out for some of these very big goals that we've had in process for several years now. Is there any further discussions or questions? Because this is an informational only item, so we don't need a motion on this, but this is the time to discuss it if there's any discussion. All right, I don't see any more, so we're done with this item. Moving on to item 13, the fiscal year 2020 work plan updates. We've got informational updates on the administration, finance, and police department work plans and decision packages in the backup. Does anyone have any questions on that for staff? No. All right. Moving on to item G1, our commendations. Chief Toronto.
Thank you, Chairman. If you see that we had several thank you letters from other law enforcement agencies, specifically the Bloomingdale Police Department and also the Forest Preserve District of DuPage County. We assisted Bloomingdale PD with that kidnapping, aggravated criminal sexual assault issue that they had in April with our investigators that were assigned to the Major Crimes Task Force, and also lent assistance in our forensic evidence technicians with a death investigation by the Forest Preserve Police, and they recognized that. And then one was just a really nice handwritten note. One of our officers was on patrol and saw a garage door open and the lights out on the residence, took the time to get out, knock on the door, spoke to a resident there. They were unaware that the garage door was open. They went out and secured it, and the residents were kind enough to send in a letter and recognize that officer went above and beyond, potentially save them from being a victim of a crime by doing that. So.
As they noted in the letter, anything from skunks getting into the garage to something much worse.
Something far worse, that's correct.
That's right. And the police department does have a program where you can let them know if you're going to be out of town. They can check on your house.
Yeah, we have vacation watches where if you call in and let us know, provide us with some information, call 630-393-2131. We'll have our zone cars keep an eye on your home. while you're away, and hopefully everything will be safe, sound, and secure when you get back.
It's a very timely reminder as the summer travel season really gets going, so thank you, Chief. All right, that concludes the business of the meeting. We have no need for a closed session, but I do need another motion. Alderman
Make
Davos?
a motion to adjourn.
A motion by Alderman Davos, second by Alderman Berry. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you.